Hello and welcome to this week's episode of writing a serverless Android app. We've got quite a few bits and pieces we'll be looking at this week. So we'll be starting by just looking over last week's code and the refactoring that's been done. We'll then be looking at the cloud console for the authentication service and kind of the extra features that are there to help you manage your sort of interaction with the auth service. And then finally, we'll start work on using the cloud database service and how we go about creating an object in that and interacting with it from within our app. So quite a lot this week, quite a lot of code this week. So without further ado, let's get stuck in and thank you very much for watching. So if you remember, last week we had a fair amount of redundancy and duplication in our code, just because obviously we were hacking away at it on a live stream and wasn't really the appropriate time to refactor. So we've done that off stream, and so I'm just going to go through some of the classes that we now have and what's going on there. First off, we now have this new Authentication Manager, which essentially handles, as you might guess, most of the authentication legwork. So here, when we are creating an instance of this Authentication Manager, we have a couple of variables that we define, a context, so we know what activity it's relating to, the auth type that it's relating to, so this allows for both our phone or email authentication. Contact string, well, that is the actual piece of contact information that we're sending. So that would either be an email address if it's the email authentication, or it would be the phone number if it's phone authentication. And then we also have this flag is login, which basically just says whether or not we are attempting to log in a pre-existing user or we are creating a new user. Again, because so much of it was very similar until really the last step, I decided to bring this all down into one manager class. So then what we actually have in that class, in this class, is a few public methods. We can start off the process of authenticating the user, whether it's for registration or login, and that starts with the send verified code method. And here, as before, we create our verified code settings object, which sets up all the settings information that we wanted to be able to use. And then basically, depending on if we're authenticating via email or phone, we'll drop down into separate methods. Now, these separate methods are basically the same, but with different auth providers. So we are literally just going to be creating the task either from the email auth provider for the sending of the email code, or the phone auth provider for the phone code. And then both of these go down into the execute class. So the other thing that we have done here is we've moved a lot of our code into lambdas, which is a feature of Java. Ooh, was it Java 8 or was it Java 9? I forget when they were introduced. But it just simplifies all these sort of having to create the new on fail listeners and the new on success listeners. So instead of creating out the whole thing, we can just define that we're going to get a verified code result back if we are in the on success listener. And if with that, we are going to just go through to the auth code dialog. And then for the on fail listener, again, we're going to get an error back and we're just going to create a toast message with this new toaster class that we set up, which again, we'll look at in a minute. So then once the request for a verification code has been sent, we are going to, as long as it was successful, go down into auth code here. And this method is just the same as we had before, where we're going to display that dialog to request the authorization code from the user. So we've got text field set up, and then a little bit of logic around when they hit the login button. So they're either going to first we're going to check to see if they are if we are trying to log in the user, or are we trying to register the user. If we're trying to log in the user, we're going to create this auth credentials object, and that is dependent on whether or not it's an email or a phone. You will have seen this from last time as well. So we'll go through, we'll create that object, and then we'll pass it into the sign-in method. Otherwise, we will just pass the auth code straight through to the register method. And then again, if they cancel, we send another toast just to say that you have cancelled, so they know, they get some positive feedback to say what's happened. So then with the sign-in method, all we're doing is taking those credentials, the credential object that we have generated, and we're going to attempt to sign in using the AppGallery Connect auth service. If we successfully sign in, the on success listener, we're going to get a sign in result back, and we're going to then call this get user method. If we fail, again, it's going to be another toast message with the error. With the registration side of things, we, again, depending on whether it's an email or phone, we create a new email user object or phone user object, and then we're going to pass that through to the auth service to create a user. If it's successful, once again, we're going to go into the same place and we're going to get the user. So finally, we have this simple method of getting the user, and that literally gets the current logged in user. So whether it doesn't matter whether you registered just now or you logged in, either way, the service is going to get the user, that user information that they have for you, and present it in this AppGallery Connect user object. From there, we are just sending a toast message to say, hey, look, we successfully got that ID. Now that's all it is at the moment. We don't actually then do anything at that point. We've just proven that the login system is working. So the other new, fully new class is this one, is the toaster. That's just a simple class that I put together to minimize the amount of make toasts messages that we had laying about. So we have a send error toast and we have a send success toast, and all that's doing differently is appending either error or success to the front of the message that's passed through, and then it just goes into this send toast method, which does the actual work and presents the toast in the context that's been provided. So as you can imagine, now that we've done all this extraction into this Authentication Manager, our activity classes are much smaller, which is good. We definitely want to try and keep that code streamlined and keep as much of the kind of logic in separate classes as suitable. So in our main class, which is our login view, we are sort of setting up all our normal views, and then all we have now is, let's get rid of that blank space. All we have now is on the phone login button, we create a new auth manager, Authentication Manager, using the auth type phone and using the phone text information, and then we trigger that send verify code, and that goes through the whole process of, as we just saw in the manager, going through sending the code, presenting the view, blah 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 blah. And again, as well with the email, we literally just set up the email button. But what I have just realized is there's a little bit of a typo there, in that was set up against the edit text fields, not the actual buttons. So I have fixed that. Nice little bug on the fly. So we've done that, and that basically is how that works. And as you can imagine, with the register activity, it's very similar. The only difference being that we have the single button with the register activity. So we are going to use the logic of, well, has the user entered an email number, an email address? Has the user entered a phone number? And depending on those things, we'll decide which how we use the auth manager. And our logic is going to be that if they've entered an email, that's always going to be used first. That takes precedent over a phone number. So that's all that is in our activities now. So we really have streamlined it, which is lovely. And that's basically the code that we now have at the moment. And what we can do is we can just we'll run that up again as we saw that bug. We'll just run this up and I can then log in and show that it's working. So here we go. And we're going to log in with my email, which is the email that we registered with last time. We're going to hit the email login, which gives us that authentication pop-up. Excellent. Okay, there we go. And that has, I'm actually already signed in. So that's one error message that can come up, is it's saying, well, actually, you have already signed in. And because we're not doing anything with that, it's still saved in the instance that I'm signed in, but we have no logic to either log us out or do something with that. So the easiest way, of course, is let's just uninstall the app like so, and then we'll fire it back up and we'll go fresh. Is going to be definitely the best way to go there. So as I said, yes, I'm allowing queue. Okay, there we go. And we will try our email address again. Bring up the authentication code. 60. It's always going to be slower when you're waiting for it, of course. 3 and log in. And there you go. So we have the success message, and then that's our UID, which you can see we are printing here. So brilliant. That's working. I'm happy with that. So let's have a little look now. Now that we've started capturing users and they've started to log in, let's have a look at what we can see about that on the admin panel, basically. So if we go into here, and we're just going to switch on to here. So we've got this console panel, which we saw last week, just to set up the authentication methods. But we have these other tabs here as well. More specifically, this users tab is the first tab, and this is going to display the information about what users have logged in to our app via the auth service. And from here you can disable users or you can delete them, and it'll tell you the authentication mode. So you've got a UID, and that is the UID on the Huawei service side for your app. So it's a unique identifier for that user in your app. So that can be used wherever you need to uniquely identify a user. You've then got the authentication mode, which is what service they use to authenticate, whether it's anonymous, email. As you can see, this is the UID that came through. This is the account for that user. And we don't really get much information, and that's by design. We're only going to get the UID, what type of authentication it was, and then this thing called the provider UID. Now that is whatever code, whatever ID the authentication service gives to that user. So for example, this is the number that comes through from Facebook when whatever this user was logged in, that's Facebook's ID for that user. This is Twitter's ID for that user. In the instances of the anonymous mobile number and email address, the Huawei first-party services, these are across the whole platform authentication for that user. So for example, every user, if you logged in with the same email address across different apps using the same service, you would still have the same provider ID here. So it's useful if, for example, you have multiple apps and you want to be able to see what users are using in more than one app. You also get when it was created, and also information about when they last logged in, which, as you can see from this date here, is literally just a minute ago when we logged in. So this is our user. And then, of course, you can delete or disable those users accordingly. But that's all the information you get about the users. It's secure, and user information is kept completely private and encrypted. It is not available. Next, though, we do have a settings tab, which is very useful. Here you can set up quite a lot of, well, basically configure the service as you need. So you can set up how many times a user can request a verification code before they are locked out. So in this instance, after 10 times, if they didn't successfully log in, it would then be frozen. And for how long the account would be frozen for. So during that time, you just wouldn't be able to log in with that account. And now you can change that. You can also set up, if you're using the password side of things, which we aren't at the moment, but if you were, you can configure here any information about the encryption that you want that to be used, or the password hashing parameters, and the rules for a valid password. So these might be how many characters it requires, the types of characters, can it match your account name. So that's useful if your company's got a specific password policy, for example, and you need to be able to kind of conform to that. So that's quite a useful thing to have, and gives you an extra level of customization as well. Next, you have the templates for the messages that are sent out either via text message or via email. So these are the messages that you get when you actually request a code, and these can be customized to however you might want. As we sort of mentioned, they do appear in a lot of languages, so you can have specific messages for specific languages, and that just allows you to add in whatever information that you might want to add as part of that process. So for example, you might have just a specific message that you want to send to a user. Basically, you can customize it there, and that can also be done per message. So you've got password reset, verification, mobile number change. So there are different messages for each type of message that might get sent out. Then finally, you can actually configure your own email server. So by default, it uses Huawei's SMTP server to send out these emails. But if you've got your own SMTP server that you might want to use, again, if you've got a company policy that says all emails have to go through our servers, or for whatever reason, you can configure a custom SMTP server there, and also configure a custom sender address. So that way it can appear to the user that you are sending the message, and it's got nothing to do with a Huawei service, which is quite useful. And it obviously gives you the ability to kind of white label this service as something that is your own. I think that's quite an important feature. So, and then finally, the final part of this is the usage tab, which isn't much use to us actually, because we're not doing anything live with SMS, but you can monitor how many text messages you're using and all that sort of fun stuff. So that is the full sort of auth service in a nutshell. We've gone through how to set up the code, how to send an email, how to authentication code, how to send a phone number authentication code. So that's, yeah, like I say, that's that in kind of a nutshell. And then this is how all the stuff that you can do with that and what you can see and all that lovely information. You can also obviously down here see by what mode people authenticated. So that might be useful if you're trying to decide what methods you want to allow. Maybe you enable a load of different methods, but really you don't want to support them all, so you can then just disable the ones that aren't really being used. So that's quite useful statistics there. So the next part of today, then, we are going to be looking at the cloud database service. So if we think about it, we've created this app. We have a way of authenticating a user to prove that that user is who they say they are, but we don't have anything else yet. We don't have a way to save any additional information about that user, and there is no kind of content in our app so far. So to start that process, we're going to use the cloud database service to create a user object and save and capture some additional information at registration time about a user. In this instance, I think we'll keep that very simply to a username. We could, of course, include other information, but I think for now, the process of getting that all set up, it doesn't matter whether you're capturing 1 field or 30 fields. It's still the same process, and it's just going to keep things a little bit more simple for today. So what we're going to do is we are going to head over and look at the cloud database documentation for a moment. So let's have a quick look at the cloud database documentation. Obviously, we're not going to look at this in too much detail because we're going to be run through it with a live demo that's, covering what is in the documentation. So if you are interested in kind of having a proper read of this, please do. We also will have a written version of this guide posted online as well. It's currently being posted to XDA and dev.to. Okay, so the sort of whole backbone of the cloud database service is the idea that you can basically store a local copy of your data as Java objects, and then you have the ability to synchronize that back to the cloud at whenever is a convenient time. So there is basically the functionality there to kind of keep a local copy of things. And the reason why that's such a good thing is, of course, it's much quicker to query a local copy of the data than it would be to query the cloud. And that, yeah, definitely does speed things up. So it's worth having, and it's a very powerful function. It also means that you can use your data offline. So that data can be stored locally, and yeah, okay, it's not getting live updates, but you can definitely use the offline version and the user can continue using your app. So for example, if it's a news function maybe, or a news app, or even like with our instance, we've got the Twitter clone, you can still go through your feed and look at past posts locally without having to pull that information in from the database. And of course, with any cloud service, it's fully scalable. So it doesn't matter if you've got 5 users or 5 million users, they can still all have access to the same data in a fast environment. As this sort of mentions, the working principle is that you have an object, an instance of that object saved locally, you have an object definition, and then you have the cloud database that's communicating, that's the wrapper that's doing the communication between your local data store and the cloud data store, and keeping those in sync when required. The platforms that are supported for this are, as we're going to be using, Android, but also iOS, web apps. You can also use it on the server side as with Java or JavaScript. Unfortunately, it's not available at the moment for cross-platform frameworks, but you can also use it as third-party libraries in Unity and Cocos. For the pricing side of things, well, you get a free tier of 2 gig storage, 150 concurrent connections, and 10 operations per second. If you need any access to more than that, you can basically contact Huawei and get pricing information. It's still a very new service that only recently left beta, so pricing information isn't currently available as far as I know. So that's kind of the broad overview of what the cloud database is. You can query it, you can do everything you'd expect to be able to do with a database, but it has that additional layer of you've got both local storage and cloud storage available. So, like I said, we could go through and look at all of this information. There's an awful lot of useful information here, and it's certainly worth reading through the documentation on this. It gives you a complete kind of end-to-end guide. But for now, we're going to look at it kind of in quite a simplistic way. and focus on that really. So what we're going to do is we're going to head back over into our AppGallery Connect console, and we're going to move down to the cloud database service. Now, when you first open this, if you hadn't already used a service that requires a data storage, you would set up your database location. We already have, so we're already set up with Germany, which is great. And then here is basically where you can define your objects that are going to be stored in the database. So what we'll do is we'll create a very basic object. We're going to call it username, or user, sorry. We're going to call it user. And that's going to have a couple of fields. So it's going to have an ID, which is going to be an integer, and it's going to be the primary key. We're then going to have the UID. So that's the ID that we get sent by the authentication service. Now, of course, those could be one and the same, but keeping them separate for possible instances where maybe we aren't using the authentication service. It's possible. We'll think about that. And I'm pretty sure that needs to be a string. I can't remember, but I believe some UIDs on the authentication do have other characters in them. So, and we'll set a default value of 0, just so there is a default value. And then we're also going to add username into this as well. And again, that can have a default value of 0. So that's that. We're then we will set up an index on the user ID. So we'll just do that, and we'll call it ID. And there we go. Finally, data permissions. We can have a user who does not need to be authenticated, such users can only have read-over permissions. Authenticated users are users that have logged in, and they are going to be able to upsert, so that's insert or update the data, and the user that creates the data becomes the data creator, and then there's also the administration. So what we're saying here is only the admin and the user that creates the data can delete it. If the user is authenticated, they have the ability to upsert it. That's not necessarily always going to be the case, but in our instance, we are going to enable that. So we'll do that, and that's just going to create our object for us. So there we go. We now have this object set up, and we can view the object, we can view the indexes, the data permissions, everything that we've just set up, and we can modify and delete it from here. Next thing we need to look at is just the database, the cloud database zone. So we actually already have one of these set up, but we are going to create a new one. We're going to call it Barker. And the cloud zones operate independently from each other. So it really, if you think of a cloud database zone as a physical database, if you want to be interacting with stuff between, like if you have different objects that need to interact with each other, they need to be in the same database. They need to be in the same database zone. So you could have multiple applications using the same object type, for example, but each application has its own database zone, so that the information doesn't cross paths, basically. Very useful. And then you've got data entries that are on the system. Of course, right now that's empty. So the next thing that we are going to do is we are going to export our objects. You would do this once you've kind of completed your definition of your schema and got it all set up. For us today, this is all we're going to have. We're going to have this one object, and essentially it's only got 3 fields. So we'll export that. And from here, you can see that you can export it to a number of different formats. For us, it will be Java, and it will be Android. We set up our package name where these objects are going to live. So that would be, let me just move this back over here so I can check on that. And that would be the site.zp web.barker.model. And we're going to export that, and that's going to save file to our computer. And then what we're going to do there is we're going to extract those files. Again, I must admit, can't see this, which is a little unfortunate. I need to have a look at that. And then over here in our app, we are going to add those into the project. So we'll create the new package, which we'll call model, and then we will save those files in there, like so, like so. So there we go. So those are our two kind of pre-generated files. Now, what I'm wondering is if this is actually going to did we? Yeah, no, I didn't. Cool. So you've got your object type info helper, which is just a pre-generated file that gives you a list of all the object types that are in your kind of schema. And as you can see, really all it's doing is creating this array and adding the user class into it. So, you know, it's nothing fancy, but it's quite useful. So that's been generated for us. And we've also got this file here, which is our actual user model and our user object. So this is what we will be using within the app and how we will be able to identify the app, identify the objects when we are sending them to the cloud and getting the information back as well. So as you can see here, it's pretty standard setup, really. You've got an initialization setup with the default values. You've got some, you've got your 3 variables, and you've got the getters and setters for all of those. So pretty standard, but it all gets generated for you, which is very useful if your schema is quite complex. You've got a lot of different models to generate. It's quite a useful little thing just to have pre-done for you, really. So those are the files that we get for free, as it were. But we obviously need to now set the project up to properly have access to the CloudDB functionality and also use of it. So the first thing we do need to do is add in the implementation to say that we are using the cloud database service. So we're just going to do that, and I think actually it's already going to have synced. That's fine. And we also update that. Why not? While we're here, we don't like Android Studio yelling at us. So once that's all set up, we now have the cloud database sort of project set up within our app, and we can start making use of that. So there's a few things that we probably want to do to make our lives a little bit easier. One of those is writing probably a wrapper to handle the database communication. Obviously, we could just go ahead and kind of use it in each of the activities that we want, but because it would get quite messy quite quickly, it's going to be much easier if we start with some sort of plan on doing that, and it's going to be a lot cleaner as well. So we are going to create a new package specifically for the database. We'll just call that DB, just to keep things fairly clear. And we are, as you might guess, we're going to create a CloudDB manager, like so. And this is where we will set up all our sort of helper methods and what have you. So there's a couple of things that we need to think about. And the first thing is that by default, the cloud database doesn't keep track of the next ID. So if you're using IDs that need to be unique, you need to keep track of what the maximum ID is in your project, and then therefore you can increment that as you go along. So one of the first things that we will do is we will create a variable to manage that, and we'll call that max user ID. And the default value for that will be 0 because before we've interacted with anything, we don't have any. So it is 0. Then we will start thinking about what kind of methods that we actually are going to want. And one of the probably the first methods that we're going to want is an initialization for this. So let's set that up. Now, what you have to do before you make use of the cloud database service is you have to initialize it. You have to get an instance and then you have to initialize it. So part of this will be that we will have when we initialize a instance of the Cloud Database Manager, we will create an instance of the AppGallery Connect Cloud Database Service. So we will call this, let's just go with, so it's Cloud. So it will be private and it will be final. And that will be the AG Connect Cloud Database. And we'll call that B. There we go. And in here is when we will get a new instance of that. So we will do CloudDB equals, and it will equal a instance. Bada bing, bada boom. Okay, so we've set up our instance of the AppGallery Connect Cloud Database. Now we need to initialize that. So we will create a method to do that. And we will call that initialize CloudDB. And we need a context for that. And that will be so. And then here we can just CloudDB dot initial. Is it no? Tell a lie. DB dot initialize with the context. Right. So okay. So we're going to need that. We're going to need to call that as sort of part of the loading of our application. So we will do that later. And then we've got to think about, well, what are we actually going to want to be able to do? What do we need to be able to interact with? And all that kind of fun stuff. So if we have a look over here, one of the things that we're going to want to be able to do is open a cloud zone. So the first thing we need to be able to do is say, right, well, what cloud zone are we going to be using for our program? And we can do that here. So let's create a cloud zone. So this might be useful as well if, for example, you do have multiple zones that you want to be able to access. Maybe you're segmenting your data by geographical area or some other decision that means that you want to be able to define which cloud zone you're using and don't want to just have a hard-coded cloud zone. So we'll write a quick method to be able to open the cloud zone. You need to open the cloud zone anyway, just to cache that zone. But like I said, you could hard code this, but we're not going to. So we'll have a public method to do that, and we'll call it open cloud db zone, GB db zone, like so. And the first thing we need to do is we need to consider what our settings are going to be for that zone or our configuration. So let's create another variable up here because that's not going to change once it's set up, I think. And we'll call that config. So in here we will configure our settings. And of course, again, that you might have some logic around that to decide what the settings are going to be. We don't. That's fine and dandy. So that's going to be a new config. And as you can see here, you've got the string, which is going to be the name of the zone. your properties and your access properties. So here it's going to be, what did we call it? We called it Barker, didn't we? We did. So we're going to use the Barker zone like that. We are going to use the CloudDB zone config dot properties, and as you can see here, you can either use the cloud or you can use it locally only. So we're going to use the cloud in our case, and then we are going to configure the access property as well. So we'll do the same thing again here, and that's access, and it's going to be public. So that's the configuration. And then finally as well, we will set up some set persistence. We'll set that to true. There we go. We've now got our configuration set up. We can now attempt to open that cloud zone and make it usable for our purpose. So here, basically, we're going to do this in a try block, but this may fail for whatever reason. And basically, all we're going to do is we're going to say cloud zone equals, and using our CloudDB, we are going to open cloud zone using the configuration that we've just defined, and also set true. There we go. And we can add the catch clause and we have our errors. So what we will actually do here as well is we will make use of the old coaster that we created, coaster object that we created, and that will make just printing out that error that a little bit easier. So we can add the context here, and then we will be able to use toaster, send error message, context, and then localized message. There we go. Okay, so basically what we're saying there is try and open up the zone, try and set it to that, otherwise it's going to fail, and we'll do a little error message printed on the screen for now. You probably want to handle that in maybe a different way, but that's fine for now. And if we're going to open the cloud zone, we should probably think about closing it as well, just in case. So here we will write a close cloud zone method. And again, that will be in a try block. And basically we're going to say cloud close the zone, and it will be the cloud zone that we've applied. We're going to attempt to close it, and we will catch any error message that happens there as well. And we'll do the same for that. And again, we will need the context to be passed through. Perfect. Okay, so that's kind of the initial setup. So we've got a method, we've got a class now that we can use to manage this. We can initialize our cloud database through this. We can then open the cloud zone that we need to deal with, and when we're done, we can close it as well. So what we will do is we'll have a way to create a new user and delete a user, and then also think about how we might get the users. So that's kind of the two things, the things that we need to think about in our current instance. So we will start with the creation of the user, because we might as well write the method where we're going to create or update the user, or as they say, upsert the user. And Then once we've done that, we can worry about actually accessing that information. So we'll create a method and we'll call it upsert user, and that's a user which should come in. Hopefully that has yeah, that's linked to our user object that was given to us. So we are going to basically let the system figure out, or let the framework figure out, is this user a new user that hasn't been created before and therefore needs to be inserted into the database, or is this a user that we have edited and therefore just needs to be updated into the user? So those two things are combined into upsert, and that just removes one other thing for us to have to worry about. We let the system decide what that user is. Is it a new user? Is it an updated user? So that's nice and simple, basically. And how do we do that, you might ask? Well, basically, it's going to be a task, and it's going to give us an integer result, and we'll call that upsert task. We're nice and creative like that. And from our cloud zone that we have already initialized and already using, now of course we may want to put a null check in here just to make sure beforehand, but in our system, in our sort of example, in our little demo, we're not going to worry about that. And as you might guess it, we basically execute the upsert, and we can do that with a list of user objects or just the one. So we're going to do upsert user and also upsert users, just to have both options available to us. And then from there, we have to we can add on success listeners and on failure listeners. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to create the second public method, and that is actually going to be I need to remember, how does it like its users in the morning, as a list. And so we can just do list of user, and we'll call that users. Yeah, fine. Cute. And that way we can create a task either for one user or for multiple users. If you know, unlikely from the user point of view, but it's certainly possible. And we'll have a private method that will execute, and that will be task integer, like so. And then essentially in here we can then define our on success listener and our failure listener. So task dot add on success listener, and that would be a new on success listener. And then we can also add on failure listener, and that would be a new on failure listener. So what we will do here is we will pass the context through. So we're going to have context there and there, and we're going to call this like so. That also wants the context. So task context, and put that over to there. And all we're going to do for now is, like we kind of did with the others, is set up some toast messages. So we'll send a success one here to context, and we can actually we'll just say upsert successful for now. Again, you could create some sort of callback here to update the UI or do something a bit more than just sending out a toast message. But we're kind of focusing on actually configuring the manager right now. So this is just a simple way to get some feedback to show that something has worked. And then the other sort of option we want to think about really is, well, how do we delete a user? So we can have a delete user method, and again, that could be delete user or delete users. I think for this one, we'll probably just stick to user for now, because we don't need to see the same again. But I'll probably refactor that, and we'll have both methods available. So here again, we are just creating a task, and it's the same kind of setup really. So and we'll call that delete task, and that is going to be the cloud database zone dot execute delete, and we can just do user like so. We can then also check to see if there were any exceptions on that, and see if we failed to delete the user for some reason, or maybe we'll just call, some sort of callback again here. So that's the other possibility there. But again, for our instance, we could even just get rid of this and just have it execute the delete. We assume, that's another option. It depends entirely on what kind of UI feedback or what kind of feedback your app will need. You can set up the success listeners, or maybe if you're not interested, you can just execute it. And whether or not it's successful doesn't actually matter in that instance in the app. That's kind of where we're getting at there. Okay, so probably the final thing that we do want to look at is we want to look at what the update this maximum user ID. Before we start looking at getting users, we want to think, well, hang on, if we get the users and another person has registered somewhere else, our maximum user ID before we get the users is going to be out of date. So before we can create a new user, we need to find out what the current maximum user ID is. So what we'll do is we'll set that up. Now, we'll have two methods. First, we want to get the current maximum ID and basically return that to the, return that in the method, so that when we're creating a new user, we can increment and get the next max ID. So we're going to return the max user ID, and that's that. We can then update. We'll then have another method, and that will be to update max user ID. And that'll take a user, and basically we'll say, well, is that user the current maximum known user ID? So here we can basically just do a simple check. So what we'll do is we'll say, well, is the max user ID less than the user get ID? If it is, the max user ID now equals the user. Like so. So at this point, we've got the update or insert of a user, and we have the ability to delete a user. But we now want the ability to get the users, and I think that's essentially the next place to go now. So the first thing to look at here is when we are just querying specific, querying for all users and just saying, right, we want all of it. So we're going to go, we'll create a public method and we'll call it get all users, and that will, as you might guess, be used to get all the users. So how we do that is we create a new task, which is going to give us a cloud database zone snapshot of users. So basically what we're saying is we're going to get an object that has, in that moment, this is the data that we have. So to create that, we'll call that, and we'll just call it task. So we're going to create that by doing the CloudDB zone execute query. Our query is going to look like, we're basically going to say we want to query where is of type user class. Give us everything, give us all of the objects of the user class. And we also have to have a query policy in place. So we'll have a cloud database zone query policy, where we can say whether or not it's from the cloud or however that's going to be set up. In our instance, that's what we're going to do. We're getting give me what's on the cloud as a snapshot right now, please, and thank you. After that, we can add in the on success listeners, and that's going to create a new on success listener. And what we will do is we will create a separate method, and that's going to be processing those results from that. And we can just create that method now. Cute. And then we can also create the failure. It's a new failure. And as you might have guessed, we will give that context do the same as we have been. Keep things nice and simple. So there we go, we'll get an error message back. And that is our processing, which we will have a look at in a minute. So the next thing though is we are going to set up the method of querying that data. And to do that, we are going to create another method, obviously. Void, and that will be query users. And that's going to pass it in a cloud database query using the user, and we'll call that query. We'll also have a context for it. Brilliant. Okay. And as you probably are going to guess, it's actually identical to this code here. And we will probably actually, yeah, I'm thinking actually, yeah, what we're going to do, we've got that, and it's passing in a query. So what we're going to do here, because all we're doing here is saying, oh, well, instead of using that, we have that. So let's do this instead. So we're going to query, and the query is going to be this one, and we'll pass in the context. And that way we don't need to duplicate ourselves. Easy refactoring. There we go. So we can either get all the users, or we can directly use the query users and pass in a custom query ourselves. Simple. That makes sense. And then we have this process query result, process results, and essentially that's going to give us, we're going to get from that an array list of users that we can then do something with. So here we will we need to create a object list, and that's going to be of users, and that is a cursor, and that will equal snapshot objects, like so. Okay. From there, we'll also create our list user objects, user list, and that will be a new array list. Go. And then we are basically going to wrap this up in a try catch, and we're going to go over the cursor. So, and we're going to create user objects from that, because we can do this dot next, and that will return cursor. Should do it. Of course, yes. So there is a exception that can be thrown there. So that's where we'll have our toast. So we do need to pass in the context there as well. And have that pass through. Cool. Okay. So with that, we can then, as you might guess, add those users to the list. User list, add user. What we're also going to do here at this point is we're going to just make sure that we've got the maximum user ID. So we've got the user, so we're going to just also update the user max ID here. And that's just going to make sure that whatever we have set is still the maximum user ID. We've got back some entities, so we need to check against those. And then once we are done with our processing of the users, we'll just also release that snapshot. So do we have? Oh yeah, so it's the that one, and we're just going to release like so. And that is essentially how you process the list of users. So we've got basically we've got a user list here, and we'd want to do something with that. Now, in this instance, right now, we're not doing anything with it. We're not doing anything with it right now, but we now have user list, and we're going to do something with that at some point. So, for example, when you're displaying a list of people, maybe a user is searching for someone or that sort of thing, that's where that might be useful. Or, of course, there's also the instance where you're specifically just getting user information about one user. But this is just kind of the basic framework of how you'd go about querying the cloud database, irrelevant of what the data actually is. You pass in a query object into this, you're going to get out of that a snapshot, and then you process that snapshot to get your objects back out and convert them into Java objects. But you can then use however you need to. So that's pretty cool. And that really is kind of the basic setup of our manager to do this. Like I said, there's quite a lot of code here. It's definitely more involved than the auth service, but I think that's kind of makes sense. It's going to be more involved. But we're not quite done yet with the setup though, so we do need to actually make use of this now somewhere. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to initialize this at the start of our application. So we are going to create a new class, and we're going to call that Barker application, and that is going to send application, and in there basically in the on create we are going to override, and we are going to override. So in our CloudDB Manager, we're going to initialize, and the context is this app. And then we just need to configure our manifest to use that class. So in here, in our top level application, we're going to have a name, and it already kind of knows what we're looking for because it's smart like that. And that is basically the initialization done. So now we want to think about, well, how might we go about using this actually within the app? So if we have a look at our registration activity, we are probably going to want an instance of this here, because one of the things we're going to be doing is inserting a new user. So let's just kind of set that all up, and we'll have DB Manager, and then we can just do this, can't we? Like so. And there we now have our instance. And during the config, we're going to want to, during our onCreate, so we'll do it down here just so it's out of the way, but we're going to want to open the database zone. And you see, this is where I'm saying, you know, we can have this as not static. So we could actually pass through the name of the zone that we want to use quite easily there. But that's then the cloud zone opened. We're essentially set up there. So we've set up the cloud zone. We're ready to actually do something with that. And yeah, I think that's a perfect place to bring it to an end. So we've managed to configure the kind of management layer of the database. We now understand how we interact with objects, how we create new objects, how we can query those objects, and sort of manage that connection between the cloud database servers and our application. So I think next week we will be taking that to sort of the next step, and we'll actually start populating that with data, both with user registration and then also looking at things like posts and actually starting to make a feed and that sort of style of content. So yeah, I just want to say thank you very much again for watching. If you've liked what you've seen so far, please do like the video and subscribe. Keep an eye out for the next episode next week. We do also live stream every Thursday at 2 p.m. So that's an early access kind of to the content in a sort of more raw, interactive way. And there'll also be a blog post version of this as well. So do check that out too. So yeah, thank you very much again, guys. And I will see you next week. Bye for now.